Of course. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining the same articulate and narrative style while slightly altering the word order and structure. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. In the shadowed hollows of West Virginia's McDowell County, far from society's watchful eyes, a generational curse took root in 1921. This curse would forever alter the genetic destiny of the Blackwood family, a darkness born from the actions of Elijah Blackwood, an Appalachian man who cursed his own bloodline, his children repeating his atrocities. This is the story of how his unspeakable actions created a legacy of isolation, physical deformity, and social devastation, a legacy that would echo through generations of his descendants. Perched on the northwestern slope of the Blue Ridge Mountains sat the Blackwood homestead, accessible only by a winding dirt path that would disappear into the dense forest during the rainy months. Here, amid the breathtaking beauty of Appalachia's wilderness, a darkness festered, one that would remain hidden for decades. Born in 1897 to coal miners who died in the infamous Menanga disaster of 1907, Elijah Blackwood was left to fend for himself at the age of 10. Young Elijah was taken in by distant relatives who worked a struggling mountain farm, and he grew into a man hardened by isolation and ignorance. By 1920, he had claimed a remote parcel of land for himself, building a crude cabin where he lived alone, rarely venturing into the nearest town of Welsh except to trade for absolute necessities. During the winter of 1921, when heavy snows cut off access to his mountain property for nearly 3 months, something inside Elijah changed. When the spring thaw finally allowed neighbors to check on the reclusive mountain man, they discovered he wasn't alone anymore. A young woman, later identified as his first cousin, Sarah, had seemingly married him during those isolated winter months. What happened in that cabin during those snowbound months would set in motion a genetic catastrophe, explains Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, a geneticist and researcher of isolated Appalachian communities. The historical record showed that Sarah had been raised in the same household as Elijah for several years after his parents' deaths. Their isolation and limited social exposure had dangerously eroded the psychological and social boundaries that typically prevent intimate relationships between close relatives. By 1925, Sarah had given birth to 3 children, twins Martha and Mary, and a boy named Jeremiah. All appeared healthy at birth, though neighbors reported that Elijah forbade anyone from coming near his growing family. The Blackwoods became increasingly reclusive, with Sarah never again seen in town. Local rumors suggested she was being forcibly kept on the mountain property, a common reality in the isolated communities of 1920s Appalachia, claims no authorities ever investigated. When Jeremiah Blackwood, age 16, finally emerged from the mountain in 1941, he was seeking work in the booming wartime coal industry. Those who encountered him described a young man with distinctive physical features, unusually close-set eyes, a protruding forehead, and a hunched posture. Though not recognized at the time, these characteristics would later be understood as the first visible signs of genetic issues stemming from consanguinity. By 1943, both Martha and Mary had also left the family homestead, settling in a small community about 20 miles away. Historical records indicate they married brothers from the neighboring Caldwell family, who themselves were second cousins to the Blackwood sisters. This further concentration of shared genetic material would prove devastating for the next generation. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel right now. You won't want to miss our upcoming investigation into America's most isolated communities, where these practices continue even today. Hit that subscribe button to join our community of truth seekers. The true horror of the Blackwood legacy began to emerge in the early 1950s when Martha and Mary's children entered the local school system. Teachers immediately noticed troubling physical and developmental issues among the Blackwood Caldwell children. According to school records obtained from McDowell County archives, multiple children exhibited severe learning disabilities, facial deformities, and behavioral problems that baffled educators of the era. In those days, there wasn't a widespread understanding of the genetic consequences of consanguinity, notes historical sociologist Dr. Thomas Harrison. These children were simply labeled as slow, sword-touched, and little educational accommodation was made for their needs. The social stigma was immediate and devastating. Medical records from the period, though sparse, indicate that several children suffered from recessive genetic disorders that are now known to appear at much higher rates in consanguineous relationships. These included congenital heart defects, intellectual disabilities, and distinctive facial features that marked them as different in their small community. Meanwhile, Jeremiah Blackwood had established himself as a solitary figure working in the coal mines. Former co-workers interviewed decades later described him as odd but reliable, with a tendency to avoid social gatherings and display unusual emotional responses. In 1952, Jeremiah, then 27, suddenly disappeared from his job at the mine. When authorities conducted a wellness check at his small company-owned house, they discovered he had relocated back to his father's original property deep in the mountains. What investigators found at Elijah Blackwood's original homestead shocked even the most hardened law enforcement officers of the era. The elder Blackwood had died years earlier, but Jeremiah had not returned alone. He had brought with him a young woman later identified as his own niece, 18-year-old Rebecca Caldwell, the daughter of his sister Martha. County records indicate that no formal charges were ever filed against Jeremiah. In the isolated culture of 1950s Appalachia, family matters were considered private, and authorities were hesitant to intervene in what was euphemistically referred to as mountain ways. Rebecca, already several months pregnant, claimed to be there willingly, though modern psychological analysis would question her capacity for consent given the family's history of isolation and possible cognitive impairments. By 1955, the pattern had fully repeated itself. Jeremiah and Rebecca remained isolated on the mountain property, eventually producing for children who would never attend school, never receive medical attention, and never integrate into broader society. The genetic damage, compounded now through multiple generations of consanguineous relationships, produced increasingly severe outcomes. A rare photograph from 1957, taken by a visiting public health nurse who had heard rumors of the family, shows 3 small children with pronounced physical abnormalities, enlarged heads, malformed limbs, and facial features characteristic of multiple genetic syndromes. The nurse's written report, rediscovered in county archives in 1989, described conditions of extreme poverty with children exhibiting signs of malnutrition alongside their congenital issues. The nurse's report represents one of the few outside interventions in the Blackwood family over 4 decades, explains medical historian Dr. Patricia Williams. Her recommendations for removing the children to proper medical facilities were never acted upon. The report was simply filed away. Another tragedy lost in bureaucratic indifference. By the early 1960s, the Blackwood Caldwell family had grown to include more than 20 individuals across 3 generations, most suffering from physical and developmental issues. They existed almost entirely separate from mainstream society, sustaining themselves through subsistence farming, occasional hunting, and the meager coal mining pension Jeremiah received. The turning point in the Blackwood saga came in 1965 when a severe winter storm forced Rebecca to seek medical help for her youngest child, a 4-year-old boy suffering from pneumonia. The attending physician at McDowell County Hospital, Dr. James Morrison, was immediately struck by the child's unusual appearance and development. "Looking at this child, I knew immediately we were seeing the effects of a closed genetic population," Dr. Morrison later wrote in his memoir. The facial features, the intellectual impairment, the physical abnormalities, they told a story of genetic inheritance gone terribly wrong. But in 1965, we lacked both the scientific tools and the social mechanisms to properly address such a situation. The young boy, despite medical intervention, died 3 days later from complications of pneumonia, exacerbated by a previously undiagnosed heart defect, a common condition in children born of consanguineous relationships. This tragedy briefly brought the Blackwood family into public view, though local newspapers delicately avoided mentioning the underlying causes of the family situation. Rebecca, in her grief and confusion, revealed to hospital staff that there were many more children back home in similar or worse condition. This statement triggered a belated investigation by county social services, though their efforts to locate the remote homestead were initially hampered by Jeremiah's threats and the treacherous mountain terrain. When authorities finally reached the Blackwood property in the spring of 1965, they discovered a compound that had grown to include 3 roughly built cabins housing multiple family members. Among them were Martha and Mary Blackwood, now in their 40s and showing signs of premature aging, along with their husbands and several adult children. These adult children had themselves begun forming relationships within the family group, creating a 3rd generation of consanguinity. If you've made it this far into this dark chapter of American history, take a moment to leave a comment saying, "Some bloodline should never have continued." Your comment helps us understand who values these historical investigations into America's hidden past. The social workers' reports from this period paint a devastating picture: 17 children, ranging from infancy to early teens, many exhibiting clear signs of genetic disorders including microcephaly, polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, severe intellectual disabilities, and facial deformities. Living conditions were described as primitive and unsanitary with no running water, electricity, or adequate food storage. The 1965 intervention represents the first time the full scale of the Blackwood family tragedy was documented, says social work historian Dr. Elizabeth Chun. What makes this case particularly heartbreaking is that much of this suffering could have been prevented with basic education about genetic relationships or earlier intervention by authorities. The aftermath of the 1965 discovery proved controversial. In an era before comprehensive child protection laws, authorities struggled with how to respond. Ultimately, 7 of the youngest children were removed from the property and placed in state institutions, a solution that, while removing them from immediate poverty, subjected them to the often harsh conditions of 1960s facilities for the developmentally disabled. Jeremiah, Martha, Mary, and the other adults were left on the property but were required to accept regular visits from county health workers. These interventions, while well-intentioned, came far too late to reverse generations of genetic damage and social isolation. The elder Blackwoods responded to this partial family separation by becoming even more reclusive. They began posting no trespassing signs along their property boundaries and reportedly threatened social workers with firearms on several occasions. By 1967, official visits had become increasingly sporadic, with some county employees refusing to make the dangerous journey to the remote compound. By the early 1970s, public health concerns had shifted toward the adult Blackwood children who had been placed in state care. Many were approaching adulthood with no capacity for independent living and complex medical needs that strained institutional resources. A comprehensive medical study conducted in 1972 documented the full extent of the genetic devastation: an average IQ of 55 among the affected family members, heart defects in 68% of the children, vision abnormalities in over 70%, and skeletal malformations in nearly all cases. The Blackwood family represents one of the most severe documented cases of genetic isolation in modern American history, notes geneticist Dr. Howard Keller. The compounding effect of multiple generations of consanguinity created a perfect storm of recessive gene expression. Nearly every system in the body was affected in these individuals. Meanwhile, back on the mountain, the remaining Blackwood family continued its isolated existence. Jeremiah, now in his late 40s and suffering from black lung disease from his years in the mines, maintained his patriarchal control over the compound. Neighbors from several miles away reported occasionally seeing family members at a distance, noting their distinctive gaits and physical appearance. The isolation might have continued indefinitely if not for a forest fire that swept through portions of McDowell County in the summer of 1975. As firefighters battled the blaze near the Blackwood property, they discovered 2 teenage boys living in a crude shelter nearly a mile from the main family compound. These boys, approximately 14 and 16 years old, had apparently never been documented in the 1965 intervention. Both exhibited severe developmental disabilities and showed signs of long-term malnutrition. This discovery reignited official interest in the Blackwood family. When authorities returned to the main compound, they found that conditions had deteriorated significantly. Jeremiah had died the previous winter, leaving no clear authority figure. Rebecca, now 41 but appearing much older, had become nonverbal and withdrawn. The remaining adult family members were subsisting on foraged food and occasional hunting. Most alarmingly, investigators discovered evidence of a 4th-generation beginning. Teenage girls in the family, themselves products of consanguineous relationships, were now pregnant. By this point, we're talking about a population with an extraordinarily concentrated genetic pool, explains population geneticist Dr. Sandra Torres. The coefficient of relationship between family members was higher than what we typically see even in controlled laboratory breeding of animals. The human suffering this represented cannot be overstated. The 1975 intervention was more comprehensive than the previous one. All remaining minor children and dependent adults, 17 individuals in total, were removed from the property. The pregnant teenagers received prenatal care for the first time, though tragically, all 3 pregnancies resulted in severe congenital abnormalities, with none of the infants surviving beyond 6 months. The state's approach to the Blackwood family sparked ethical debates that continue to this day. While removing vulnerable individuals from dangerous living conditions was necessary, the institutional settings where many were placed often failed to provide appropriate care for their complex needs. Several died within years of being institutionalized, while others spent decades in facilities with varying quality of care. The Blackwood case raises profound questions about society's responsibility to intervene in isolated communities, notes bioethicist Dr. Richard Barnett. Earlier education and outreach might have prevented generations of suffering. Yet, respect for cultural differences and family autonomy often delayed intervention until the damage was irreversible. The legacy of Elijah Blackwood's original transgression against natural and social boundaries continued to echo through the 1980s and beyond. Medical researchers, with the family story now documented in academic literature, used blood samples from surviving members to study the effects of extreme inbreeding on human genetic expression. These studies contributed significantly to understanding recessive genetic disorders, though they raised ethical questions about consent given the cognitive limitations of many participants. By 1985, the original Blackwood property had been reclaimed by the forest, with only stone foundations remaining to mark where cabins once stood. The land eventually reverted to the state for unpaid taxes, later becoming part of a national forest. Few visitors to the beautiful mountain trails realize they are walking near the site of one of America's most tragic genetic disasters. The surviving Blackwood descendants, now scattered across various institutions and care facilities, gradually lost connection with one another. Their family identity, once maintained through isolation, dissolved into individual cases managed by the healthcare system. By the 1990s, the last individuals who remembered life on the mountain were aging, their stories rarely shared due to cognitive limitations or institutional privacy practices. A final haunting coda to the Blackwood saga emerged in 2002 when genealogical researchers discovered that several children born in surrounding counties during the 1960s and 70s shared genetic markers with the Blackwood family. This suggested that some family members had occasionally left the compound and integrated briefly with nearby communities, spreading genetic material that continued to express itself in subsequent generations. What makes the Blackwood case particularly significant is how it demonstrates the extended impact of consanguinity beyond the immediate family, explains genetic counselor Dr. Rachel Porter. These genetic signatures can persist in a population for generations, even after the original family unit has dissolved. Today, medical professionals estimate that hundreds of people in the Appalachian region may carry genetic material influenced by the Blackwood family's isolated breeding. Most will never experience symptoms, as the genes are now sufficiently diluted through outbreeding. However, occasional cases of rare recessive disorders in the region prompt geneticists to consider possible connections to this historical case. The Blackwood tragedy serves as a somber reminder of how isolation, geographic, educational, and social, can create conditions where harmful practices persist unchallenged. It also highlights the tension between respecting cultural differences and protecting vulnerable individuals, particularly children born into circumstances they cannot control. In many ways, Elijah Blackwood's decision in that snowbound winter of 1921 created ripples that continue to this day, concludes sociologist Dr. Harrison. His actions quite literally cursed his own bloodline, creating a legacy of suffering that persisted through multiple generations. The story reminds us that our choices, particularly regarding family formation, can have consequences that extend far beyond our own lifetimes. As modern genetic testing becomes more accessible, stories like the Blackwoods become increasingly rare in developed nations. Education, mobility, and social services create safety nets that generally prevent such extreme cases of genetic isolation. However, researchers caution that in remote areas around the world, similar situations may still exist, undiscovered. If you've watched all the way to this conclusion, you clearly appreciate these deep investigations into America's hidden history. Please leave a comment saying, "I watched it all," so we can get to know who truly values these stories on our channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that button now to never miss our weekly explorations of America's darkest secrets. And if this story affected you, please hit the like button and share it with others who appreciate learning about the hidden corners of our nation's past.